What happens when I get drunk at a block party and admit I sleep with the man next door? How does my quiet husband answer when the street laughs, the group chat explodes, and our daughter asks why Daddy moved to the guest room? Why did a stranger hand me papers in a bright lobby while my husband watched me run out of words? Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. My name is Melusine Quill, and I've always believed that honesty makes me brave. People say I talk too much when I drink, but I call it freedom. The night everything started, I stood in front of our neighbors at the block party with a glass of cheap wine and said I sometimes sleep with Dorian from downstairs. Everyone laughed first, thinking it was a joke. I laughed too. My husband, Aaron, didn't. He just stood there holding the cooler lid, his face still. The next morning, I told him I'd exaggerated, that it was just a line. He didn't argue. He made coffee and asked if I remembered what I said. I told him it was honesty in disguise, that I wanted to make him see how neglected I'd felt. He said nothing. Now I keep replaying that silence, how calm it sounded. I thought anger meant love, but his quiet scared me more. I posted that we were strong enough for truth, pretending it was all part of some healing process. But Aaron's calm turned into something else, measured, distant, and deliberate. I didn't know then that quiet people don't stay still. They build, they plan, and they finish things properly. The morning after the block party, my head hurt from wine and embarrassment, but not for the same reasons as everyone else. I woke up believing I could still control the story. Aaron was already in the kitchen, standing by the counter in his grey t-shirt, scrolling on his phone. The air smelled like burnt toast. I tried to sound light. I said, "You know I was joking, right?" He said, "You said it 3 times. I laughed and said, "People exaggerate when they drink." He said, "You said it like a fact." I brushed past him and poured coffee, pretending I wasn't shaking. I said, "Everyone knew I didn't mean it." They laughed. He said, "They laughed at me." I rolled my eyes and said, "Oh, please, you're not a victim here." He didn't answer. He just moved his cup to the far end of the counter. That small distance between our mugs felt bigger than the whole kitchen. I checked my phone. Group chat messages from the neighborhood were already coming in. Half jokes, half concern. Someone had written, "Only Melusine could say that out loud." I screenshotted it and posted it with a caption. "Radical honesty makes fragile people nervous." When I looked up, Aaron was watching me. I said, "I'm fixing it." He said, "You're repeating it." I said, "Because silence lets rumors grow." He said, "Rumors die faster than truth spoken wrong." I didn't understand what that meant until later. He went to the sink, rinsed his mug, and said, "I'll be in the guest room tonight." I said, "Oh, so now you're punishing me?" He said, "No, I'm choosing quiet." I laughed and said, "You're dramatic." He walked away without another word. Around noon, I knocked on Dorian's door. His wife Lena answered, wearing a robe and a sharp stare. I said, "Is Dorian home? I just wanted to clear the air." She said, "You already filled it." I said, "It was a joke." She said, "You told it too well." She closed the door before I could respond. Back upstairs, I found Aaron at his desk. His laptop screen showed a spreadsheet filled with numbers and initials. I asked, "Since when do you do spreadsheets at home?" He said, "Helps me think." I said, "About what?" He said, "What matters?" I laughed and said, "You and your lists." He minimized the window. That night, I stood on the balcony with another glass of wine and made a new post. Truth is better than secrets, even messy truth. Comments started pouring in. Some called me brave, some called me sick. I liked the brave ones. When I came inside, Aaron was standing by the dining table, staring at the wall planner. A red circle marked the date of the block party. He picked up a pen and circled another date 2 weeks ahead. I said, "What's that for?" He said, "A reminder." I said, "For what?" He said, "Peace." I took that as sarcasm and said, "You sound like a self-help podcast." He said, "Maybe I should start one." Then he left the marker on the counter and walked to the guest room. Later that evening, I texted my coworker, Sacha, saying the whole thing had blown out of proportion. She replied, "You said you sleep with your neighbor." "What did you expect?" I wrote back. "People love a scandal. I'll turn it around." She sent a single emoji, a shrug. At midnight, I couldn't sleep. I walked down the hallway, listening. From behind the guest room door, I heard faint typing. I knocked. Aaron said, "Go to bed." I said, "We should talk." He said, "We will, when it's not noise." I went back to our bedroom and lay awake, scrolling through the comments again. Someone had tagged Aaron in a photo from the block party, me laughing, wine in hand, him in the background, face frozen. The caption read, "That look says everything." I told myself people were jealous of how real we were. That's what I kept repeating, real, not perfect. The next morning, I cooked breakfast as a peace offering. When Aaron walked in, I said, "See? I'm trying." He said, "Trying to distract." I said, "Trying to fix things." He said, "By posting more." I said, "By being open." He said, "You mistake exposure for openness." I dropped the spatula and said, "You could just forgive me." He said, "Forgiveness is earned quietly." I stared at him, trying to find any sign of softness. Nothing. He took his plate, ate in silence, and left for work without saying goodbye. The apartment felt too big after that. I messaged Dorian again. No reply. His wife must have told him to block me. I texted anyway. We should clear things up before people twist it. The message stayed unread. By afternoon, I started rewriting the story in my mind. Maybe I could tell people it was a prank, or say I was referring to a dream. Something clever, something that made me look smart, not desperate. When Aaron came home, he went straight to his desk again. I leaned against the doorway and said, "You're not going to talk to me forever." He said, "Talking isn't the same as listening." I said, "You love sounding deep." He said, "No, I love peace." I said, "You're making me look like the crazy one." He said, "You don't need help with that." For a second, I almost threw the glass in my hand, but he didn't even flinch. He just looked at me and said, "When you're done shouting, lock the door behind you." Then he left. I stared at his empty chair and noticed a sticky note on the desk that said, "Bring forms." I didn't know what that meant. I tore it off and threw it away. Before bed, I stood by the guest room door again. No sound this time, just the faint glow of his phone lighting up and then going dark. By Monday morning, I was sure the story had cooled off. It hadn't. When I walked into the pharmacy, everyone fell quiet for a second too long. I smiled, pretending not to notice, and said, "Morning," as if nothing was wrong. My shift-led Kendra gave me a small nod and pointed to the back. "Quick word when you have a minute," she said softly. I said, "Sure thing," and laughed like it was about scheduling. It wasn't. I could feel their eyes on me as I filled prescriptions. One of the younger techs, Mina, whispered to another, "That's her," when I turned. I said, "If you're going to talk about me, at least tag me next time." Mina blushed and looked away. I felt a strange pride in it. Fame was still fame. During my break, I checked my phone. Someone had uploaded a clip from the block party to the local community page. The caption said, "She really said it." I looked at the comments, half disbelief, half mockery. I hearted a few of them. I even replied to one, "At least I'm not a liar like most wives." When Kendra called me into the back room, I carried my coffee like armor. She closed the door gently and said, "You're trending." I said, "Not everyone can say that." She sighed. "It's not good attention. The manager's seen it. HR will want to talk. I said, I didn't break any laws. She said, you embarrassed yourself and mentioned your employer in the comments. I said, that's free speech. She said, it's bad optics. She slid a paper across the table. It wasn't a write-up, just notes with words like professional image and brand sensitivity. I said, so now I'm a liability. She said, you're talented, but this is messy. I said, marriage is messy. I just said what others think. She said, then maybe you shouldn't say it at work. I left before she could finish. Out in the pharmacy again, I saw Aaron's name flash across my phone screen. I answered. He said, you're on video again. I said, you're watching my haters now. He said, no, I'm documenting. I said, you sound like a lawyer. He said, I sound like someone who's done. Then he hung up. When I got home, the smell of printer toner filled the air. His laptop was open on the table, a spreadsheet displayed again, lines of numbers and letters filling the screen. I said, you're obsessed with that thing. He said, it's cleaner than conversation. I said, you're not funny. He said, I'm not trying to be. I saw a new folder on the desk labeled household. I said, you're labeling our life now. He said, someone has to. I said, you're acting like this is evidence. He said, maybe it is. I laughed, but it came out brittle. Later that evening, I joined a video call with my friend Tessa. She said, you're all over my feed. I said, at least I'm interesting. She said, it looks bad, Mel. You should delete it. I said, no, if I delete it, they win. She said, who's they? I said, everyone who pretends they're better. She sighed. After the call, I checked Aaron's calendar on the wall. The red circle from last week was still there. Now another one had appeared. Downtown, 4:10 p.m. I said, you're seeing someone? He said, no. I said, then what's downtown? He said, a personal meeting. I said, you're so mysterious lately. He said, you made noise. I need quiet. He poured coffee and put 2 mugs on the counter, one near him and one near me, but not close enough to touch. I said, is this your idea of teamwork? He said, it's called distance. I said, that's childish. He said, no, it's practice. The next morning, I walked to the stairwell and saw Mrs. Sato carrying her mail. She looked at me kindly but said nothing. I said, you know it was just a joke. She said, sometimes jokes grow teeth. Then she kept walking. I watched her go, angry that she dared to sound wise. At work, Kendra told me HR wanted me in the small office at lunch. The HR rep had a clipboard and a stack of printed screenshots. One had my comment highlighted. At least I'm not a liar like most wives. She asked, do you feel that represents our company values? I said, it represents being real. She said, we prefer professional. On the clipboard, I noticed the top sheet had a single word written in block letters. Statement. I said, are you filing something? She said, just documenting. That word again. When I got home that night, Aaron was on the couch, scrolling quietly. I said, guess who almost got fired for being too honest? He said, guess who doesn't care? I said, you used to. He said, used to, yes. I sat beside him and said, so you'll just stay mad forever? He said, not mad, just learning. I said, learning what? He said, how to finish properly. He stood, took a folder from the coffee table, and carried it to his desk. I followed and said, you think your neat files make you righteous? He said, they make me ready. He minimized a screen as I stepped closer. I said, why are you hiding things? He said, because you don't respect what's quiet. I rolled my eyes and said, you're boring everyone, including yourself. He said, I'm not performing anymore. I stared at the locked drawer on his desk and said, you're acting like we're strangers. He said, we are, finally. When I turned to leave, the faint ping of his phone stopped me. On the screen flashed a message preview. Follow-up confirmed. He quickly muted it. I said, "Is that work?" He said, "It's personal." I said, "With who?" He said, "Someone who listens." I left the room, furious but unsure at what exactly. I poured wine, opened my phone, and posted a picture of the city lights from our balcony with the caption, "Some people confuse silence with strength." In the reflection of the window, I saw Aaron behind me for a moment, closing the guest room door again. By Saturday, the neighborhood group chat had turned into a public court. Every hour, someone added a new joke, a meme, or an old photo from the block party. My name had become shorthand for humiliation. Pulling a Melusine, they called it. I told myself I didn't care. I told myself fame always comes with noise. That afternoon, the community center hosted a charity event, and I decided to go, partly to prove I wasn't hiding, partly because I wanted to see how Aaron would act in public. He said, "You should stay home." I said, "Then they win." He said, "Who?" I said, "The ones who think they know us." He said, "Maybe they do." At the event, music played, children ran with painted faces, and folding tables filled the hall. I wore a new dress and bright lipstick, smiling too widely. When I arrived, people paused mid-conversation. Some nodded politely, others just stared. I raised my glass and said loudly, "No secrets here, right?" A few people laughed uncomfortably. I pretended it was support. Aaron stood by the drinks table, hands in his pockets. Dorian was there too, avoiding my gaze. His wife, Lena, whispered something to him, and they moved to another corner. I felt my face burn. I said to a woman near me, "People love pretending to be saints." She said, "People love watching fire." I caught Aaron's eyes across the room. He was speaking to the event organizer, calm, polite, as if none of this touched him. That made me angrier than if he had shouted. I wanted him to react, to prove he still cared. When the host called for a toast, everyone lifted their glasses. I joined, but before I could speak, the host said, "To honesty in our homes and our hearts." Some people glanced at me. I raised my glass higher, smiling. "To that," I said. The laughter was soft, uneasy. Someone behind me whispered, "Unbelievable." I turned and said, "At least I'm not pretending." The room went silent for a beat. Aaron stepped forward and said quietly, "Melusine, that's enough." I said, "Oh, so now you care about appearances?" He said, "Always did. You just never noticed." He walked away, leaving his untouched drink on the table. I stared at it for a moment before tossing mine back. Later, in the parking lot, he opened the car door for me without looking up. I said, "You don't get to act noble now." He said, "I'm not acting." I said, "Then say something real." He said, "You've said enough for both of us." The ride home was silent. The radio played a slow song, and the sound of the turn signal filled the space between us. When we reached the driveway, he didn't turn off the engine right away. He said, "I think we should stop going to these things together." I said, "You're embarrassed of me." He said, "I'm tired of being your backdrop." I slammed the door and went inside. The next morning, I woke to the faint hum of the printer again, the smell of toner mixed with coffee. I walked to the desk. The printer spat out blank sheets one by one. I said, "You're wasting paper." He said, "It's for spacing." I said, "You're losing it." He said, "I'm getting ready." There was a USB stick lying beside the laptop, labeled 614. I asked, "What's that?" He said, "Backup." I said, "For what?" He said, "For memory." I grabbed it and said, "You're not saving anything about me." He said, "You already shared everything." I said, "That's different." He said, "Yes, yours was public." I threw the USB back at the desk. He didn't even flinch. In the afternoon, my mother called. She said, "Your aunt saw the video." I said, "It's old news." She said, "She cried." I said, "Then she's dramatic." My mother said softly, "You used to be kind." I said, "You used to listen." She sighed. Aaron doesn't deserve this. I said, "Oh, of course you're on his side." She said, "Someone has to be." Then she hung up. I sat in silence, staring at the living room window. Outside, Mrs. Sato was watering her plants. When she looked up and met my eyes, she didn't smile. That evening, Aaron cooked dinner for himself. I said, "No plate for me." He said, "Didn't know you'd be home." I said, "Where else would I go?" He said, "Anywhere that's not a camera." I said, "You're still mad." He said, "I'm done being mad." He ate quietly, scrolling on his phone. I saw a message thread open briefly, titled "Follow Up." He minimized it as soon as I moved closer. When he stood to wash his dish, I said, "You're going to talk to me eventually." He said, "Maybe, when there's something left worth saying." He dried his hands, placed the dish neatly on the rack, and walked to the guest room again. I followed and said through the door, "You think ignoring me makes you righteous?" He said, "No, it makes me peaceful." The door latch clicked shut. I stood there shaking and said, "You can't leave without me noticing." He said from the other side, "I already did." I lay awake that night listening to the faint scratch of a pen. He was writing something again. Notes, lists, whatever those were. The next day, I found the guest bed made perfectly, pillows arranged as if no one had ever slept there. On the desk was a thin binder labeled Utilities. I flipped it open. It was thicker than it should have been. Receipts, bank slips, all neatly organized. At the bottom was a small sticky note. "Bring forms." I tore it up. I wanted to scatter the pieces, but instead I shoved them into my pocket, like evidence I didn't understand. That afternoon, a neighbor stopped me outside the building. She said, "He's handling this well." I said, "Handling what?" She said, "Whatever this is." I said, "You don't know anything." She said, "No, but I know calm men are dangerous." When I got home, Aaron was sitting at his laptop again, earphones in. I shouted, "Are you even listening to me anymore?" He paused the audio and said, "Every word." I said, "Then say something." He said, "Not yet." The faint beep of his phone alarm sounded. On the screen flashed paper drop, 3:20 p.m. He swiped it away. The next weekend, my sister came over. She said she was checking in, but her eyes went straight to the guest room door, still closed, the way it had been for days. She asked, "So, are you two separate now?" I said, "Don't start." She said, "Everyone's talking." I said, "Everyone loves to." She said, "Even Mom thinks you should apologize." I said, "For what? Having a mouth?" She sat on the couch and looked at the stack of folders on the table. "What's all this?" she asked. I said, "His little control museum." She flipped one open. Inside were labeled tabs: home, auto, bank. She said, "He's organizing." I said, "He's staging a performance." She said, "No, he's protecting himself." I laughed and said, "From me?" She said nothing. When Aaron came home, he greeted her politely. She stood up and said, "You two need to talk." He said, "We've said everything." I said, "He means I've said everything." She said, "He looks calm." I said, "That's his trick." He said, "Calm isn't a trick, it's survival." She sighed, muttered something about needing air, and left. The silence she left behind was heavy. I turned to Aaron and said, "You're making everyone think I'm a monster." He said, "You're doing that fine without me." Later that night, I heard him on a low call from the hallway. His voice was steady, measured. "Yes," he said, "all backed up." A pause. "No, I don't need to meet in person yet." He turned when he noticed me standing there. I said, "Who was that?" He said, "A follow-up." I said, "Work." He said, "Personal." I said, "Stop saying that like it means something." He said, "It means boundaries." I laughed and said, "You're turning into one of those self-help men who think detachment is holy." He said, "No, I just think decency should be quiet." He went into the guest room and shut the door again. The lock clicked. I stood outside, furious, and said, "You're ridiculous. We're married." He said from inside, "Not for long." The next morning, I found the shredder plugged in. There were thin strips of paper in the bin, perfectly even. I said, "You're shredding our life." He said, "No, I'm cleaning what's already ruined." I tried to distract myself by going to my parents' house that afternoon. Mom opened the door with a sigh. "You look tired," she said. I said, "Everyone says that when they want to feel superior." She said, "I say it because you look haunted." At dinner, my father asked, "How's Aaron?" I said, "Detached." He said, "He always seemed patient." I said, "That's the problem. He's too calm." My father said, "Calm men are thinking men." I rolled my eyes and said, "You all act like he's perfect." My mother said, "No one's perfect, but he's careful." I said, "You're on his side." She said, "I'm on the side that still believes in shame." I slammed my fork down and said, "You don't know what it's like living with silence." My father said, "Then you should have appreciated sound." I left before dessert. When I got home, Aaron was at his desk again, headphones on, typing. The hum of the shredder had stopped, replaced by the faint whir of the printer. I saw a page slide out, blank as usual. I said, "Still wasting ink?" He said, "Still watching." He removed his headphones and said, "Melusine, do you know why you talk so much?" I said, "Because I can." He said, "Because silence terrifies you." I said, "You're not a psychologist." He said, "No, I'm a husband trying to unlearn." I said, "You can't just erase 10 years. He said, "I'm not erasing, I'm archiving." I said, "Stop using that word like it makes you righteous." He said, "It makes me ready." He turned off the lamp and said, "I'll handle this properly." I said, "Handle what?" He said, "What's left?" I said, "You're threatening me." He said, "No, promising peace." He walked past me, calm as ever, and went to bed in the guest room. I stood there, staring at the closed door, my own breath sounding too loud in the hallway. The next morning, our neighbor's kid knocked on the door by mistake, holding a mail package addressed to Aaron. I took it, thanked him, and closed the door. The label said storage options. I opened it. It was empty, just a return slip inside. I left it on Aaron's desk. Later, my phone pinged, a text from my sister. "He's getting advice, Mel. Be careful." I wrote back. He wouldn't dare. She didn't reply. At dinner, I tried to bring up normal things. I said, "Remember our trip to the coast?" He said, "I do." I said, "We could go again. Reset." He said, "I'm not resetting what's already ended." I said, "You think walking away makes you noble?" He said, "No, it makes me done." He gathered his plate, rinsed it, and stacked it on the rack. When he turned, I said, "You can't just end something because you're embarrassed." He said, "You ended it the night you opened your mouth." I felt something crack inside me. "You'll regret this," I said. He said, "Not this time." He went to the calendar and crossed off today's date in red. Beneath it, a new one was already circled, Friday. I said, "Another meeting?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Downtown again?" He said, "Does it matter?" He took the utilities binder, slid it into his bag, and zipped it shut. I said, "You're not walking out on me." He said, "I already did. You just haven't noticed." That night I heard him on another low call. The words were slow, deliberate. "Yes. All documented. Friday confirmed." I pressed my ear to the wall. When he hung up, I whispered, "You think you can outsmart me?" The next morning, he left early. On his desk, only one note remained. Meeting, personal, downtown, 9:45 a.m. The week dragged by like a countdown. Every day Aaron left earlier, came home later, and spoke less. He stopped making coffee for two. The fridge became a place for single portions. His labeled neatly in clear containers, mine left scattered. Even the sink looked divided. 2 cups, 2 plates, never touching. By Wednesday, I started to feel a weight pressing on my chest that I couldn't name. I told myself it was guilt, but I didn't believe that. I told myself it was fear, but that didn't fit either. It was something colder, a kind of waiting. I tried to start a conversation that morning. He was at his desk, closing a folder labeled household. I said, "You've been busy pretending to be organized." He said, "Not pretending." I said, "So what's all this paperwork for?" He said, "Structure." I said, "You talk like a teacher." He said, "You talk like a confession you regret." He stood, slipped a USB stick into his pocket and said, "You should make plans for next week." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because I will." That scared me more than if he'd yelled. That afternoon, I tried to control the story again. I recorded a video for my social page, me sitting on the couch, speaking softly into the camera. I said, "People love to judge, but honesty doesn't destroy relationships, lies do." I ended it with, "We're stronger than gossip." I posted it, tagged him, and waited. He didn't respond. An hour later, I saw he'd blocked me. I stormed into the guest room, but the door was locked. I said, "You can't just block your wife." He said through the door, "You can't tag your husband like a brand." I said, "You're making yourself the victim." He said, "No, I'm making myself free." That night, the sound of the shredder filled the apartment again. I covered my ears and shouted, "Stop destroying everything." He said, "I'm clearing space." I said, "For what?" He said, "Peace." I couldn't stand it. I went to the balcony, called my sister, and said, "He's trying to scare me with silence." She said, "He's protecting himself." I said, "From what?" She said, "From you." I hung up. When I came back inside, Aaron was sitting at the kitchen table, writing something by hand. I said, "You planning your next quiet stunt?" He said, "I'm making a record." I said, "Of what?" He said, "Of truth." I laughed, pacing. "You're turning into one of those men who narrate their pain." He said, "Someone has to narrate yours correctly." I walked closer, snatched the page, but it was blank. "You think this makes you clever?" I said. He said, "No, it keeps me calm." He picked up his pen, wrote one line at the top and slid it toward me. "Handle this properly." I said, "You keep saying that like it's some spell." He said, "Maybe it is." He folded the page, tucked it into a folder, and stacked it neatly on the table beside the others. Each one was labeled, dated, precise. It scared me how methodical he looked, like he'd already detached from the idea of us. The next morning, he was gone before sunrise. I found his phone alarm still set, blinking faintly. Paper drop, 11:30 a.m. At work, my coworkers avoided me. Mina asked, "Are you okay?" I said, "Never better." She said, "He seems done." I said, "He's bluffing." She said, "He doesn't look like a bluffer." By afternoon, Kendra called me into her office again. She said, "This is your last warning. Keep your personal life offline." I said, "My personal life is my brand." She said, "Then your brand is unemployed." I left before she could say more. When I got home, Aaron was at his desk, laptop open, phone beside him. I saw his contacts list flash briefly. One contact was renamed with just a white circle emoji. I said, "Who's that?" He said, "Someone neutral." I said, "You think you're clever hiding numbers?" He said, "You think you're safe because you perform." I tried to snatch the phone, but he locked the screen. I said, "You're secretive now." He said, "I learned from the best." He closed the laptop, slid the USB into a small envelope, sealed it, and placed it inside his bag. I said, "You're paranoid." He said, "You're loud." I stood there, hand shaking. "If you wanted to leave, you'd just say it." He said, "Leaving is the last step. I'm still in the middle." The clock on the wall ticked loudly. I said, "Say what you're planning." He said, "You'll find out soon enough." That night, I dreamed of paper, pages flying around the apartment, each one with my name written wrong. When I woke, he was gone again, his side of the bed cold, untouched. In the kitchen, a new note sat beside his empty mug. Downtown 3:35 p.m. I crumpled it. He wasn't fooling me. By evening, he returned, calm as ever. I said, "So, did your little meeting go well?" He said, "It went properly." I said, "Stop using that word." He said, "It's the only one that fits." He took off his jacket, placed it neatly over the chair, and said, "I'm done arguing." I said, "Then what?" He said, "Now I document." I followed him to the hallway. "You think silence gives you power," I said. He said, "It gives me clarity." I said, "And what about me?" He said, "You already have noise." He reached for the lamp switch, pausing. "You know what I've realized, Melusine?" he said. "Truth isn't loud, it's signed." I said, "What does that even mean?" He said, "You'll understand." He turned off the light and went to the guest room. I stayed standing there, heart racing, staring at his desk. The top drawer was locked again. I pressed my ear close and heard a faint mechanical sound. A phone vibrated inside, then went still. The silence that followed felt like a closing door. Friday arrived cold and cloudless, the kind of day that looks peaceful from the window but feels heavy once you step outside. Aaron was already dressed when I came into the kitchen. He wore his navy coat, clean shoes, and that expression of quiet readiness that I had started to hate. I said, "Big day?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Another one of your mysterious meetings?" He said something like that. He placed his mug in the sink and said, "You should stay home today." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because I want you to." I said, "That's not a reason." He said, "You'll see soon enough." Then he took his bag and left. The door closed with a soft thud, but it felt final. I poured myself coffee I didn't want and sat by the window. Down below, his car pulled out of the driveway and turned toward downtown. I watched until it disappeared around the corner. For a moment, I almost felt relieved. I could breathe again, walk barefoot through the apartment, talk out loud without being ignored. But then I saw his desk. Clean, every surface bare, except one folder labeled Home. The binder labeled Utilities was gone. So was the USB stick. I told myself I wasn't going to snoop. I told myself I was above that. Then I opened the desk drawer anyway. It was empty, except for a single sheet of paper folded twice. On it was written, "If you're reading this, you'll understand today." That line chilled me more than any threat could. I slammed the drawer shut and paced the apartment. Around noon, my phone buzzed. It was my sister. She said, "Where are you?" I said, "Home. Why?" She said, "Aaron posted something." My stomach dropped. I opened my social feed. There it was, a short, plain statement on his profile. Moving forward properly. "Thank you for understanding." No photos, no comments, just silence gathering underneath. I called him immediately. No answer. I tried again. Still nothing. I left a message. "You think posting vague nonsense makes you strong? It just makes you cold." I waited, pacing. By 1 p.m., I couldn't stand it. I grabbed my coat and went downtown. The train felt too bright, everyone's faces too sharp. I kept telling myself he wouldn't dare make this public. He wasn't that kind of man. When I got off near the Civic Plaza, the wind caught my hair, pulling it across my face. I saw his car parked neatly by the curb, hazard lights off. I followed the direction people were moving, toward the courthouse lobby. Inside, the marble floor gleamed like water. People passed with folders and briefcases. I spotted him instantly. He was standing by a tall desk near the security checkpoint, speaking to a woman in a navy blazer. calm, polite, steady, the same way he had spoken to everyone since the block party. I called out his name. He turned, met my eyes, and didn't look surprised. He said, "You shouldn't be here." I said, "You can't tell me where to be." He said, "You made everything public. I'm just catching up." I stepped closer. "What are you doing here?" He said, "Finishing." I said, "Finishing what?" He said, "What you started that night." The woman in the blazer approached me with a clipboard. "Mrs. Quill?" she asked. I said, "Yes." She handed me a sealed envelope. "You've been served," she said, voice neutral. I blinked, staring at her hand like it held a live wire. "Served what?" I asked. She said, "Petition for divorce, including temporary financial and possession orders." I felt my throat close. "You're joking," I said. Aaron said, "I told you I'd handle it properly." The sound of the lobby filled my ears, the echo of shoes, distant phones, the dull hum of air vents, everything except my own breathing. I said, "You planned this behind my back?" He said, "You gave me no choice." I said, "You could have talked to me." He said, "Talking was your weapon." I tore open the envelope, flipping through the pages without seeing them. My name, his name, typed lines, signatures, waiting. "So this is your revenge?" I asked. He said, "No, this is balance." The woman nodded once, stepped back, and left us standing there in that strange half-quiet. I said, "You can't just erase everything we built." He said, "I'm not erasing, I'm releasing." I said, "You sound like a therapist." He said, "You sound like someone still performing." I held the papers to my chest and said, "You really think this makes you the good guy?" He said, "No, just the free one." He picked up his bag from the counter, nodded politely to the security guard, and started walking toward the doors. I followed, my voice rising. "You can't walk away like this," I said. "I made one mistake." He stopped, turned slightly. "No," he said. "You made it a performance." People were watching now. I hated how calm he looked while I trembled. I said, "Say something angry for once." He said, "Anger's how you keep people watching. I'm done with that." He stepped outside into the bright, cold light. I chased after him, the envelope clutched in my hand. "You'll regret this," I said. He said, "I already regretted staying." The automatic doors hissed shut between us. For a few seconds, I stood inside, staring through the glass. He walked down the plaza steps, slow and deliberate, the same calm rhythm he'd had all month. Then he stopped to sign something with the woman from before. She nodded, handed him a copy of whatever it was, and walked away. I ran out onto the steps. "Aaron," I shouted. He looked up, met my eyes one last time, and said quietly, "It's all filed." My knees felt weak. "You really mean this?" I asked. He said, "I've never meant anything more." He turned, slipped the signed paper into his bag, and walked toward his car. I stood there, surrounded by strangers, holding the divorce petition in my hands. Someone nearby whispered, "Is that her?" I heard the sound of a camera shutter. The noise echoed like a slap. I wanted to scream at them all, to say it wasn't supposed to end like this, that it had been a joke, that I was just drunk, that I was only being honest. But the words wouldn't come. The only sound I made was a small breath that caught halfway. Inside the envelope, one page was folded differently from the rest. At the bottom of it, in his steady handwriting, was a single line. "Handled properly. Effective immediately." I sank onto the cold marble bench by the steps. My phone buzzed again. Messages from my sister, co-workers, even Lena from downstairs. I didn't open any of them. The notifications blurred together. Through the glass, I saw Aaron's reflection vanish as his car merged into traffic. No shouting, no final speech. Just the quiet exit of someone who had already lived his decision weeks ago. The petition pages fluttered in my lap from the passing air as people walked by, their eyes sliding over me like I wasn't there. When I finally looked down again, I saw my own name in print, bold and clear. next to his. No edits, no hashtags, no audience left to convince. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.